Welcome to the deep dive. We're jumping straight into a really significant and honestly fast-moving area today, the current state of transgender rights.
And the legislation surrounding them, yeah. It's global, but we'll focus a lot on the U.S.
Exactly. We want to unpack what's happening, specifically looking at sports participation, uh, bathroom access, and healthcare for transgender individuals. These seem to be the main battlegrounds.
They really are. It's a landscape that's, well, it's evolving incredibly quickly. And it touches on some really core societal questions,
Yeah.
about fairness, individual rights.
And how we understand identity itself.
Precisely.
Okay, so just to give you a sense of the scale here in the U.S., the Williams Institute estimates around, 1 million adults identify as transgender.
That's right. And importantly, the proportion is higher among young people.
Right. But then you look globally, and the rights, the protections, they vary enormously. You've got places like Canada with quite progressive laws.
And then other countries with much more restrictive policies. It's a real patchwork.
And even within the U.S., there's this interesting tension, isn't there? We had that big Supreme Court ruling in 2020, Bostock v. Clayton County.
Huge, yeah, that established that employment discrimination based on gender identity is, well, illegal under federal law, a major step for workplace protections.
A really crucial step. But then, almost in parallel, we've seen this massive surge in state-level legislation pushing the other way.
Definitely. The ACLU tracked, I think it was over 500 anti-LGBTQ plus bills introduced just in 2024.
Just 2024, yeah. And more than half specifically targeted transgender people. It really shows where the legislative energy is at the state level right now.
And what's fascinating, or perhaps predictable, is how these efforts keep circling back to the same few areas.
The ones we mentioned: sports, bathrooms, and healthcare access.
Exactly. Those three consistently come up. You see new laws, intense debates.
Okay, so let's unpack these then, because these are the core areas for our deep dive today. You have the proponents of these, let's call them restrictions, often talking about
Things like fairness in sports, maybe privacy concerns in bathrooms, or sometimes appeals to tradition or established norms.
right. And then on the other side, you have the critics. This includes major medical groups, human rights organizations.
And they're pointing to evidence-based practices, particularly in healthcare, and framing it as a matter of fundamental human rights. They argue these restrictions are discriminatory and cause real harm.
So our goal here is to really dig into those arguments, look at the evidence, and just lay out the core issues for you.
Let's start with transgender participation in women's sports. This one gets a lot of headlines.
It really does. And we've seen a pretty sharp increase in state-level bans since about 2020, haven't we?
Oh, absolutely. By 2025, we're looking at 26 states in the U.S. with laws that effectively ban transgender youth from playing school sports consistent with their gender identity.
26 states. And the Williams Institute estimates that affects over 100,000 young people, ages 13 to 17.
That's the figure, yeah. 115,500, I believe. It's a significant number of kids.
It really is. And Idaho was one of the first, right? With HB 500 back in 2020, though that got held up in court initially.
It did, but the trend didn't stop. You saw states like Arizona, Montana, New Hampshire follow, extending into 2025. Some even cover college sports.
And Georgia, just recently, in 2025, passed a ban defining eligibility by, quote, biological sex at birth. That seems to be the common language.
It often is. And, this isn't just a U.S. thing. We're seeing similar moves elsewhere.
Like in the UK.
Yeah, British Cycling brought in a ban in 2023 for elite women's events. And England's Football Association, just this year, 2025, updated their rules too,
How so?
basically excluding individuals not assigned female at birth from women's leagues. They even cited a UK Supreme Court ruling about the Equality Act defining sex as binary.
Wow. And some of these policies I read involve things like mandatory hormone testing or even potential genital examinations.
That's been part of the controversy, yes. It raises serious questions about necessity, privacy, and just dignity, really.
Absolutely. So what's the argument for these bans? What are proponents saying?
Well, often the core argument revolves around perceived physical advantages. The idea that even with hormone therapy, transgender women or girls who went through male puberty might retain advantages, particularly in strength or speed.
Like Representative Earhart in Idaho argued.
Exactly. And they sometimes point to studies, like one in sports medicine from 2020, that suggested some strength advantages might remain after a year of hormone therapy.
Okay, so there's that study. But what's the counter argument? What does other science say?
Well, the picture is more complex. Major sports bodies like the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, their guidelines reflect a different understanding.
How so?
They note that hormone suppression, over time, maybe 2 to 3 years, generally aligns the athletic performance metrics of transgender women with those of cisgender women.
Yeah.
So their rules often allow inclusion under specific conditions like monitored hormone levels.
So it's not quite as simple as permanent advantage. The duration of hormone therapy seems key.
It seems to be a very important factor, yeah. And then you have arguments against the bans from groups like the Human Rights Campaign or athletes themselves like Schuyler Baylor.
What's their main point?
They often emphasize the potential harm these bans cause to transgender kids' mental health and social inclusion. Plus, they question whether there's actually widespread evidence of trans athletes dominating women's sports in a way that creates a fundamental imbalance.
And people like Billie Jean King, the Women's Sports Foundation, they've weighed in too, right?
They have, often highlighting that historically, inclusive policies haven't actually prevented fair competition. They argue that inclusion and fairness can, and often do, coexist.
Is there data on the impact of inclusive policies?
Yes, actually. A 2019 survey by GLSEN, that's an LGBTQ plus education network, found that having trans-inclusive sports policies in schools was linked to lower depression and a better sense of belonging for trans students.
And importantly, did it find any negative impact on cisgender athletes?
No, the survey didn't find negative impacts on cisgender athletes' experiences.
That's interesting, but there have been some unintended consequences of the bans, haven't there?
There have been reports, yeah. Anecdotally, in places like Utah, there were concerns about cisgender girls facing harassment or suspicion just for being very talented athletes,
Yeah.
being accused of being transgender because they were good.
Wow, that's a really concerning side effect. So legally, where do things stand? Are these bans being challenged?
Oh, definitely. As of now, bans in 5 states are actually blocked by court orders. Arizona and Utah are examples.
On what grounds?
The ACLU and others are often arguing these bans violate Title IX's. That's the federal law banning sex discrimination in education. They argue sex here includes gender identity.
And at the federal level, any movement?
Well, it's mixed. The U.S. Senate rejected a bill in 2025 that aimed for a federal ban on trans girls in women's sports. So some resistance there.
But the state-level lawsuits are ongoing.
Exactly. And it's quite possible the Supreme Court could eventually weigh in, which would obviously be a major development.
Okay, let's shift gears then. Bathroom access restrictions, another really contentious area.
Hugely contentious. And again, lots of state-level action. As of 2025, we're seeing 19 states with laws restricting transgender people from using public restrooms matching their gender identity.
19. And that affects quite a lot of people, right?
Yeah, the Movement Advancement Project estimates it impacts about 26% of the trans population aged 13 and older.
A quarter of the community. And these laws aren't all the same, are they?
No, they vary. You've got about 6 states where the ban applies broadly to government buildings. 7 others focus on K-12 schools, sometimes other public spaces too, and then 6 focus just on schools.
Can you give an example?
Utah's HB 257 from 2024 is a pretty typical example. It restricts access in public schools and government buildings based on genitalia assigned at birth. There are very narrow exceptions, like for certain surgeries.
And I heard some states even criminalize noncompliance.
2 states, yes, which raises the stakes considerably. Potential legal trouble for just using the restroom.
That's incredibly serious. And again, like with sports, this isn't purely a U.S. issue.
No. We mentioned that UK Supreme Court ruling from 2025 clarifying the Equality Act. Following that, a UK government minister publicly advocated for excluding trans women from women's toilets.
And there was proposed legislation in England, too.
Right, in 2024, proposing mandatory single-sex toilets in new public buildings, though schools and prisons were exempt in that proposal. So the debate is happening internationally.
So what's the rationale given for these bathroom bans here in the U.S.? What are supporters arguing?
The arguments usually center on privacy and safety. You'll hear legislators, like in Utah, express concern that allowing trans people into bathrooms matching their identity could somehow be exploited, posing a risk.
Okay, that's the concern. But is there actual evidence backing that up? Do inclusive policies lead to more safety incidents?
Well, that's the crucial question, and the evidence largely says no. There was a 2015 Media Matters study looking at 17 school districts with inclusive policies. Found zero correlation. No increase in safety incidents, linked to the inclusive policies.
Zero. What about the flip side? Do discriminatory policies have an impact?
That same 2019 GLSVN survey we mentioned earlier actually found a link in the other direction.
Mhm.
Discriminatory school policies were associated with higher rates of assault against transgender students.
So the policies intended, ostensibly, to increase safety might actually be making things less safe for trans kids.
That's certainly what the data suggests and what advocacy groups argue. The National Center for Transgender Equality calls these laws cruel and dehumanizing. They point to the mental health toll, the isolation.
What about solutions like single occupancy, gender-neutral bathrooms?
That's often proposed as a compromise. And they can be helpful for many people, not just trans individuals. But critics argue that requiring trans people to use them can still feel stigmatizing, like they're being segregated. Plus, they aren't always available or practical.
And legally, what's the basis for arguing for inclusive access?
Again, it often comes back to Title IX for schools and the broader Civil Rights Act. The idea that discrimination based on sex includes gender identity. The Gavin Grimm case, though settled before the Supreme Court ruled definitively on the merits for schools nationwide, was a key battleground for this.
So practically speaking, what's the day-to-day impact of these bans on trans people?
Reports, like one from the ACLU in 2023, suggest it creates a climate of fear. Transgender youth, especially, end up avoiding bathrooms at school or in public altogether, which has obvious health and dignity implications.
That sounds incredibly stressful.
It is. But conversely, you do have states pushing back. California, for example, has shield laws protecting access. These cover a large number of trans youth.
And what about the corporate response? We saw a big backlash to North Carolina's HB 2 years ago. Is that still happening?
It seems less pronounced now, perhaps. The widespread corporate condemnation we saw in 2016 hasn't been quite as visible with every new state law, though some companies certainly still speak out. But the grassroots activism, the legal challenges by groups like the ACLU, that remains very strong.
Okay, let's move to the third key area, gender-affirming healthcare. This feels like perhaps the most intense area of debate right now.
It really does, particularly when it involves minors. As of 2025, we have 26 states banning gender-affirming care for minors.
26. That's over half the country.
It is, and the Human Rights Campaign estimates this affects about 37% of transgender youth, ages 13 to 17, a huge proportion.
Wow. Arkansas was the first back in 2021, right?
Yes, then others like Texas, Oklahoma followed. And it's notable some of these bans aren't just limited to minors under 18. Some extend into young adulthood, up to age 26 in certain cases.
And what kind of care are we talking about being banned?
Typically, it covers puberty blockers, hormone therapy, and gender-affirming surgeries for minors. Sometimes just specific procedures are banned. Sometimes it's a broader prohibition.
And this is happening despite opposition from major medical groups.
Exactly. The American Medical Association, the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, WPF, the Endocrine Society, all the major relevant medical bodies have guidelines supporting access to this care when clinically appropriate, and they oppose these legislative bans.
Are these bans being challenged legally, too?
Yes. Currently, bans in 2 states are blocked by courts, and there are, I believe, at least 17 lawsuits ongoing across the country challenging these laws.
And internationally. Is access to care also under scrutiny elsewhere?
It is. In the UK, for instance, there's been a lot of debate and scrutiny around NHS waiting times and the model of care, particularly for youth. There have been controversies there as well.
And here in the U.S., it's not just outright bans, right? There are other restrictions.
Correct. Some states, like Florida, have restricted public funding. So impacting Medicaid coverage for gender-affirming care or care for incarcerated individuals, it's another way access is being limited.
Okay, so what does the medical evidence say about the impact of providing or denying this care?
Well, the evidence supporting the benefits is quite strong. A major study in pediatrics in 2022, for example, found that access to gender-affirming care, including medical interventions, is associated with significantly lower rates of depression and suicidal ideation among transgender youth.
Lower depression, lower suicide rates, that seems incredibly important.
It's a critical finding. And conversely, the bans create immense hardship. Families forced to travel long distances, sometimes even relocate entire households just to get necessary medical care for their child. The financial strain, the emotional toll, it's enormous.
And the medical community sees these bans as interference.
Yes. The American College of Physicians, for example, explicitly opposes them, calling it legislative interference in the patient-physician relationship And in evidence-based practice, they emphasize that these decisions should be made between patients, their families, and their medical teams. And the scale is vast. They estimate nearly 240,000 trans youth live in states with these bans.
Are there any counterbalancing supportive policies, like the shield laws we mentioned for bathrooms?
Yes, states like California have similar shield laws for healthcare, aiming to protect patients traveling from states with bans and the providers who treat them. These laws offer refuge for a significant number, around 147,000 trans youth live in states with such protections.
And at the federal level.
It's that same push and pull.
Yeah.
The Biden administration revised Section 1557 of the Affordable Care Act in 2024 to strengthen protections against discrimination based on gender identity in healthcare.
But there are also federal bills aiming for bans.
Yes, like H.R. 1399, which sought a national ban on gender-affirming care for minors. So conflicting efforts at the federal level, too.
What about public opinion on this? Is it as divided as the legislative action suggests?
It seems to be. That 2022 Pew Research survey showed significant public division. For instance, 41% favored bathroom bans, but there was also strong opposition, 38%, to restricting education about gender identity in schools. So it's complex.
And is misinformation playing a role here?
Advocates argue strongly that it is.
Yeah.
Anti-LGBTQ plus groups often circulate claims linking trans-inclusive policies to safety risks, claims that generally lack credible evidence. There's a real push from rights groups for more education to counter what they see as harmful narratives.
Taking a step back then, looking at all three areas, sports, bathrooms, healthcare, what does this intense legislative focus tell us about the broader cultural or political climate?
Well, it seems to clearly reflect a deeper cultural and political divide in the U.S. and elsewhere. You can trace the influence of specific conservative advocacy groups in drafting and promoting model legislation that states then adapt.
And the idea of a wedge issue.
Right. Some activists have explicitly described using issues like transgender participation in sports as a way to energize a base and potentially open the door for broader restrictions later on in bathrooms, in healthcare, in education.
But it's not the whole story across the country, is it? We mentioned California, Colorado.
Exactly. It's crucial to remember there are states actively moving in the opposite direction, implementing inclusive policies, trying to find ways to balance fairness, safety, and the rights and inclusion of transgender people. It's not monolithic.
So looking ahead, what are the key things to watch?
Definitely the legal battles. Any potential Supreme Court cases in the U.S., rulings like the one in the U.K., these will be pivotal in shaping the legal landscape for years to come.
And the advocacy continues.
Absolutely. Groups pushing for comprehensive non-discrimination laws at the state and federal level, working on cultural acceptance and understanding. That's ongoing. And ultimately, it comes back to the human impact.
That quote from Skylar Baylor.
Yeah. Trans kids just want to play with their friends. It's a simple but powerful reminder of what's often at stake beneath the complex legal and political debates.
This has been a really thorough look. It's clear that transgender rights across sports, bathrooms, healthcare are at a really critical point. It highlights these deep disagreements about fairness, inclusion, and identity in society.
It really does. And while the arguments for restrictions often raise concerns about, say, privacy or competitive balance, the available evidence often doesn't seem to support those fears being realized through inclusive policies.
In fact, the bans themselves appear to carry significant negative consequences for the health and well-being of transgender individuals.
That's what much of the data indicates, yes.
So it seems that moving forward, policies grounded in medical understanding, legal precedent for non-discrimination, and a focus on inclusion might offer a more equitable path, one where everyone gets a chance to, participate fully.
A path towards creating environments where people can thrive.
If you listening want to explore this further, the ACLU at aclu.org and the Human Rights Campaign at hrc.org are great resources for ongoing information and advocacy efforts.
And maybe just to leave you with a thought, considering everything we've talked about today, what does a truly equitable society look like when it comes to the rights and well-being of transgender individuals? Something to reflect on.